So I just saw Transformers 1 and I kind of loved it. I thought it was a really good movie, and my experience was heightened because I went to a fan event and everyone in the audience, you could tell they really loved the material, the toys, the comics, the TV shows, all of it. And that just made me appreciate it even more and have more fun with it. It did help that they gave us these really cool little trinkets at the beginning. And so that put me in a very good mood. Um, but yeah, this movie is probably the best Transformers movie I have ever seen. I have seen a good chunk of the most recent ones, with the exception of one or two here and there. And while I have always had fun while watching them, usually by the time it ends, I forget it immediately. I could not tell you a single thing about the lore of Transformers if my life depended on it up until this movie. This movie actually made it really digestible, and it's um, a lot more than just clanking metal, crashing into stuff and looking cool and transforming. It does have a lot of that.
But I also think that it kind of is more cohesive than anything we've seen. And I think a large part of that is the fact that there are no humans in this movie. I think humans in the past have complicated the live action movies too much. It just doesn't make sense why they're in there. They don't really do anything to the plot. They just complicate things and distract you from getting to know the big characters who are doing most of the heavy lifting, most of the fighting and the fun stuff. And then here you get to know them a lot more. And I think that in that way it gets you more engaged with the material and more interested in the lore than it ever has in the past, which works for this movie so much. So one thing that surprised me most about this movie was how surprisingly sophisticated it was for a kids movie. There are so many, there's just the storyline itself of having the origin of this greatest enemies in the Transformers universe, Optimus Prime, Megatron, start off as best friends and minors, and how they work their way from the bottom to leadership to eventually rivals. I thought that that was very interesting. It gets dark in some places, and I feel like this movie is going to be very impactful for certain children. This is going to be like one of those movies that definitely makes a core memory, a core impression on them, which is really special to see, especially now when I'm able to look back at movies that influenced me as a kid, and be able to point out that this is gonna be one of those. It's really fascinating. It makes me appreciate the movie that much more. So yes, this film does focus on that relationship between Optimus Prime, Orion Pax, and Megatron, D16, and it's just they very much give them the Magneto Professor X treatment, where they are start off as best friends, and then eventually divulge into mortal rivals, and that there's still something there, and that adds a lot of tension, and it really does give a lot more layers to the relationship that we know, as opposed to Megatron just being like this bit generic bad guy, which I personally, having watched a lot of the Transformers movies, that's I could not tell you any of his motivations, but in this film, it really does leave an impact, and you can kind of understand why he went the way he did, which again, too more sophisticated than I thought it was going to be. I also think Chris Hemsworth does a great job as Optimus Prime. He is able to portray Optimus Prime as a young robot, kind of developing his leadership skills. He still has that hope, that optimism that is so notable for Optimus Prime, but he lacks a lot of the fine-tuning, the leadership skills, and those are things that he acquires throughout this movie. And as he grows more into the Optimus Prime that we know. And Chris Hemsworth does a lot with his voice work, from sounding so young and hopeful, but then going to being a pretty good approximation to the Optimus Prime that we all know and love. And I think that for that, great job in whoever decided to cast Chris Hemsworth. And then as his opposite, we have Brian Tyree Henry, who again goes through a transformation from good guy to bad guy. I mean, it's not a spoiler. This is like the big selling point of this movie, is that it's the origin story of their battle, their rivalry. And he does a really good job guiding the audience through that journey, through that change within him, even if he's not always supported by the script. But again, for a kids movie, the fact that we're even having this conversation is a pretty big deal. And so you can excuse the fact that the script doesn't always support that transformation. It does seem like a really fast shift. But Brian Tyree Henry does a great job. He's a great actor who can elevate that material, which is really rare. And I really hope that he gets more work, more voice work, more live action work. Just I want to see more of him because everything he does, he's always been great. A supporting character that really made an impression was Keegan Michael Key voicing Bumblebee. Now we know B from all of the movies, but he's always been largely silent, only being able to communicate with his radio. But now we're seeing him when he was young and free and didn't have that. And so he really provides a layer of fun to this movie. He's a comedic relief for sure, but he never gets too overbearing. He definitely does get annoying to the other characters in the film, which is just makes it more enjoyable for the audience. I personally think that all of his jokes landed for me. He was just a great breath of fresh air for the movie and really helped move things along and keep things from going as dark as they could have been, or as dark as some of the live action films sometimes go to, where it's just like you stop caring. Humor really is key to the audience's heart, and I think that he kind of is that for this movie. He also has a continuous line of trying to create a nickname for himself, Badassatron, and I think it works. I've been saying it nonstop since I've seen them film. I really do think that his character is Badassatron. Now, when I got home from the screening, I had to look more information into this movie because I was just pretty impressed by it. And I was surprised to find that the director, Josh Cooley, actually directed Toy Story 4, which was arguably one of the weaker entries in that franchise. But now he goes on to make this Transformers 1, which is arguably the best entry in the franchise, at least in the last 2 decades or so. And so kudos to him. I think he really understood what makes Transformers work. Just storytelling also, he did a great job with presenting a story that is more or less simple, but still very complex at the same time. And I think he brought also that ability to, Toy Story was a story about toys, and Transformers, kind of the main selling points were their toys, their toy line. And so I think that he brought that toy-like nature to the character designs in this movie, which really worked for it. And I kind of wanted to go out and buy a toy afterwards, which I'm sure is in large part the point of these movies, but it works. And that also kind of leads me to just the character design overall was amazing within the 4 main characters. But then you also had this like side villain called Arachnid, I think, or Arachnid or something like that. But essentially she was like this spider transformer who transforms into a helicopter. And I just thought her design, I hadn't seen anything like it before in the Transformers movies, and I thought she was really interesting, and definitely something that I would want to see more of because she's just kind of cool. But yeah, this movie went harder on everything than it had to. The animation was beautiful. There were certain scenes where I felt like I could reach out to the screen and touch it and it would be real. So kudos to the animators who I'm sure spent so much time and effort and just long hours in making this film be what it is, and they did a great job with that. But yeah, as you can tell, I really like this movie. I don't think that it's for everyone. I think if you have kids or if you are a kid, definitely, if you're a kid at heart, definitely go watch this movie. If you're a Transformer fan, for sure you have to go see this movie. But as far as like general audiences go, I don't think this is like a must watch in theaters right away, even though I do think you'll have a good time. I would pretty much put that on how much you want to go to the movies this weekend, and how much you want to see a new movie this weekend, because this movie you're not going to have a bad time at it. That's for sure. But yeah, I was surprised by how impactful this was and by how many deeper messages there were. It ends with the closing line of Optimus Prime saying that he will essentially fight for the freedom and autonomy of all sentient beings. And I think that that's really an interesting line to throw into this kids movie, because it's something that we are seeing out in the news every day, people trying to fight for their bodily autonomy, for their own freedom to be. And it makes perfect sense within the realm of this film to add that conversation, add that layer. But again, something that did not have to do, that I appreciated, and appreciate that film that much more. So that was my thoughts for Transformers. Overall, I think this film is badassatron.